Welcome to Arab Center, Washington, D.C. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Center, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for this webinar dealing with a timely issue, Biden's trip to the Middle East, objectives and potential outcomes. As all of you know, Joe Biden's highly touted, highly publicized first presidential trip to the Middle East is well underway. The 4-day trip, which started yesterday in Israel, is actually Biden's 10th such visit career-wise. It is scheduled for July 13 through 16, so we're halfway through the visit, with, of course, 2 additional stops beyond Israel, one in the occupied Palestinian territories and one in Saudi Arabia, where the president will meet with GCC and other Arab leaders. Unfortunately, I noticed in the media coverage the last couple of days, some have referred to this trip as a 2-stop trip, somehow only limiting it, at least in their depiction, to Israel and Saudi Arabia. But I think the stop should not in Palestine should not be ignored. Anyway, Biden's visit to the region comes, of course, as all of you know, amid very shifting geopolitical relations and intensifying regional and global crises. In addition, of course, to Israeli leaders, the president is expected to meet with Saudi officials and other Arab leaders in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, amid talk of further Arab-Israeli attempts at normalization, additional steps, and specifically the eventual or potential inclusion of Saudi Arabia in the Abraham Accords, while at the same time continuing to pay the usual lip service to the rights of Palestinians and their pursuit, to quote the president, pursuit of freedom, prosperity, and democracy, as he's fond of saying. And needless to say, no mention at all of an Arab-Israeli peace process, a political horizon for the Palestine question, an eventual end to military occupation, or independent Palestinian statehood. And despite repeated attempts and at clarification since the, if you will, the inception of this notion or idea of a visit to the region, the White House and the Department of State, including explanation, of course, by the president himself in his July 9th hasty last-minute op-ed piece. Many questions still persist in spite of all this explanation as to whether Biden will succeed in achieving his declared objectives. Of course, first and foremost, according to him, is enhancing Israeli security, which it appears just from yesterday and today's visits and signing agreements and statements, it looks like he has at least fulfilled that aspect to Israel. But with regards to other issues, it remains to be seen as to what extent he will be able, for example, to press Saudi leaders to significantly, let's say, from his perspective, increase oil output, or officially normalize relations with Israel beyond some symbolic steps, or end the war in Yemen, or pay more attention to human rights, since he assured us, Biden that is, assured us that human rights will remain central to all his stops and to the whole visit. So will recurrent and widespread human rights violation, including, for example, the killing of journalists Jamal Khashoggi and Shireen Abu Akleh, among others, be indeed a priority during Biden's trip. The visit also comes in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine, which has caused both energy and food crisis globally, and led to US attempts to try to bolster its influence, to try to deny its shifting away, pivoting away from the region, and to bolster its own influence again in the region to counter both Russia's and China's renewed, more assertive, if you will, expansionist aims in the region from an American perspective, or assertive presence in the region. Further, I think compounding this swirl of political considerations, I would say, particularly surrounding the trip, are ongoing negotiations over a revived Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and its potential, one, to restore Iranian oil supplies to the global market, maybe easing the price of oil at the pump here in the United States, or let's say, along with renewed talks of, which is contradictory to that first goal, building a US-backed anti-Iran regional military alliance. I mean, how do you build a military alliance against one country at the same time you're trying to reach an agreement, a major agreement with that particular country? Are these two objectives reconcilable? And of course, in addition, the president is facing the recent collapse of the Israeli coalition government, which portends to possible, I guess, the possible return of former Likud Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the scene, which is not necessarily, just knowing from past experience, not necessarily welcomed by Biden. I mean, their relationship is a love-hate relationship, in spite of the shake hand yesterday at the tarmac, even though the president promised not to shake hands with anybody for his own safety, but he did, I guess, with Netanyahu. So at any rate, we have a lot of questions to tackle today. Arab Center Washington, D.C. Is delighted to convene this webinar to examine, as we said, the objectives, the implications, the expected outcomes of this trip. And we are very honored to have with us a panel of renowned experts to help us discuss all these issues, to try to answer some of these questions at least, and assess whether Biden's campaign promises of a foreign policy guided by American values, whatever the definition is of American values pertaining particularly to human rights and democracy, whether these have been trumped by strategic, economic, and geopolitical considerations, especially in the US, where we are facing a midterm election year. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce my colleagues in the panel here. And in the order they will be speaking, each will have 12 minutes to make a presentation, initial presentation. And then by the time all four of them speak, we will have the balance of our time, about 30 minutes, to basically spend on questions and answers and entertain your questions. The audience is mixed from, again, so many different countries this morning. We welcome you and we invite you to participate. You may, of course, send your question via the Zoom platform at the bottom of your page, or those of you who are watching on the website, our website, or YouTube, or what have you, you can send your questions via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org, and staff will forward the questions to me, and I will be more than delighted to pass your questions to our panelists. Starting this discussion today is Sarah Leah Whitson, Executive Director of Democracy for Arab World Now, DAWN. And she will be, of course, making some remarks based on her lifelong career in defending human rights in the region. Her name is equated with human rights in the Middle East and democracy, as it pertains, of course, particularly to this visit and to the rationale as presented by the White House for this visit. Does it make sense? Next to Sarah Leah Whitson, we will have also Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who will be joining us any minute. And he will be, of course, focusing on his area of expertise, particularly Biden's Iran policy, how this visit will advance or delay, harm, if you will, the talks with Iran regarding the nuclear deal, and that contradiction that I referred to earlier between, on the one hand, Biden seeking to form a military alliance against Iran, at the same time pretending or claiming to be working hard to reach an agreement with Iran. So hopefully Trita will help us to try to decipher that contradiction. After Trita, we will have Cinzia Bianco, Gulf Research Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And her expertise, of course, is focused on the Gulf countries, the Abraham Accords, US-Saudi relations, and of course, the issue of the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on oil markets and so on. So she will be tackling those questions for us as pertaining to the visit. Finally, Zaha Hasan, our friend from the Middle East program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, joining us. We're grateful for that, all the way from Palestine, from Algeria, where she's visiting with her family there. And she will focus her remarks particularly on the Palestine issue, the lip service that we have seen thus far with regards to the visit, and whether the visit will have any impact whatsoever, and definitely touch on Palestinian public opinion and the general reaction to the visit, which doesn't seem to be getting a lot of publicity. There are several articles, of course, that talk about Palestinian disappointment, but we hope to get a little bit in-depth analysis, as always, from Zaha regarding this. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again, and let's go ahead and turn the microphone on now to Sarah Whitson. Sarah.
Hi everyone. Great to see all of you. And thank you, Khalil, and to the Arab Center for organizing this important and timely event amidst what I think we can all more fairly label the Biden Summit for Autocracy. I think my colleagues on the panel are sure to spell out the many reasons why the Biden administration's trajectory towards reaffirming the failed decades of American policies in the Middle East are a bad idea. We've been hearing quite a bit about how inevitable Biden's return to support for the tyrants in the Middle East is, in light of spiraling oil prices, the need for support against Russia, containing growing Chinese and Russian influence. There's been a drip among the blob and journalists and writers about why it's so essential for Biden to return and restore relations with Saudi Arabia in particular. But there's clearly a lot of shame attached to this visit, and that's why Biden had to put out this unprecedented op-ed in the Washington Post justifying his trip, as well as this funny little directive from his doctors that the White House tweeted, banning him from shaking hands, even though he's just breached it. It really does remind me of the Israeli ritual of shooting and crying. You know, the Biden administration is telling us why, you know, they really don't want to do this, but this is why they have to do this, and so forth. I think talking about these developments as inevitable is useful because it helps mask some of that shame and throw up our hands and woe is us and we're resigned to our fate. What can we do? We are tethered to the worst abusers in the Middle East. Of course, Biden is going much further than any previous administration with this new security agreement that will, for the first time in US history, commit our country to defending Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Israel, of course, in writing, and as well as the tangential satellite states like Bahrain and Jordan. We don't really know what President Biden is committing us to because the administration has kept it a secret for reasons that have to do, I believe, with that shame, because US and Congress will recoil at such a plan and they need to quietly sneak this agreement in. My own view is that these moves of the Biden administration, as signaled, as represented by Biden's current trip to Saudi, Israel, and Palestine, as you noted, they are an inevitable outcome of sorts, but they're not tied to US interests, but the corruption of our government, which has become beholden to foreign government, defense industry, and fossil fuel interests. They work to justify a worldview that only US hegemony can secure their interests, protecting Israel and Saudi and the UAE as US interests, containing Iran is a US interest, weapons sales are US interests. The historical record has shown how disastrous this worldview has been, in fact, to US interests, to say nothing of the people in the region who paid most dearly for US support for dictatorships, wars, and apartheid rule of the Middle East. I want to use up my slot today to address some of the arguments that have appeared in favor of Biden's doubling down on support for the Middle East tyrannies, as I think encapsulated by the proposal put forward by Martin Indyk and Stephen Cook at the Council on Foreign Relations in a report they released, I guess, 2 weeks ago. I think that while their arguments do very clearly serve Israel's and Saudi's and UAE's interests, they don't serve America's. First is oil. You know, we need oil, we get that. But the notion that, as they argue, that Saudi is the only oil producer with sufficient excess capacity to calm the oil markets, or that if we reconcile with Saudi, which to them means delivering Saudi this unprecedented security agreement, then, as they say, more oil on the global market should mean relief at the gas pump for America, is provably false. The Biden administration has already told us that even increased output by Saudi and UAE, which they've actually agreed to do now, will have no material impact on oil prices in America. It's very doubtful they are going to break their OPEC production pact with Russia, as Indyk and CFR think we can get them to do. It's just too profitable. In fact, the Biden administration has not demanded it, and they're getting everything they want because of high oil prices. So why on earth would they break this pact? And if Biden were really serious about how high a priority the price of oil is, he could end the self-inflicted injury that is causing these oil prices to be so high, end sanctions on Venezuela, Iran, and Russian oil. Right now, the only thing these sanctions accomplish is, well, pushing the price of oil higher and higher, including to their benefit. Second, Russia and China ties, which really is another way of saying weapons sales. So the argument goes, if the US provides Saudi and UAE with all the weapons they want and grants them the security agreement they've been demanding, it will, quote, diminish their desire for them to develop, quote, ties with China and Russia. But let's be honest, what they're really talking about here is diminishing weapons sales to China and Russia. What freaked out the Biden administration were Saudi and Emirati plans to build Chinese factories to build missiles in each of their countries, plus increased weapons purchases from Russia. They obviously did that to punish the Biden administration for putting blocks on some weapons sales to their countries when he came to power. But of course, even giving them the security agreement does not guarantee, and there are no promises, and they will always dangle in America's face their option to turn to Russia and China to get silence and support for their war crimes and gross abuses. Shut up, or we walk to their side. It's absurd to think that they will ever give up that leverage. You've also heard the argument that their weapon systems are too locked into our weapon systems to really become independent from them. So rest assured, weapon sales from the US will continue. And I think the selling point is that our products are more effectively lethal than Russian and Chinese products. But here's the rub. We're once again confusing the interests of the weapons industry with the interests of the American people. What do the American people lose if Saudi and UAE bought all of their weapons from Russia and China? It's a bad bargain from America if the only way to maintain our influence with so-called allies is to sell them our security guarantees, which is really just a mercenary US military to come to their aid and all the deadly weapons they want. It actually endangers the region and endangers us by entangling us into their instability and the conflict that it promotes. We're addicted to fossil fuels. Americans are addicted to fossil fuels. We know that. And I think we're taking some steps to address that. That's an addiction, not just of the US public, but of US industry as well. But the American people have no need for weapons sales. The American people don't profit from weapon sales. Weapon sales put American troops at risk of more wars, more destruction, more lost limbs, more blown up bodies. The sooner we can unhinge our policies from the profit interests of weapon companies, the safer, healthier, and stronger our country will be. Third, Iran. I know that Trita will be addressing some of this, so I'll be very brief. That one of the principal arguments that's being made for supporting a Saudi, Israel, UAE bloc with a security agreement that's promised to be a NATO light, but still a security agreement, is that it's the best way to address containing Iran. In fact, Indyk and Cook want us to provide the Sunni Israel axis with a nuclear umbrella. This, I think, is wrong on many, many levels. And again, I won't go into all the reasons why Iran is neither the principal source of instability in the region, nor an actual threat to the United States. But if you don't have to take my word for why a security agreement is such a bad idea, particularly with respect to a potential conflict with Iran, but take the words of our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who argued very eloquently in an op-ed in the New York Times in 2017 why such a security agreement would be a bad idea. It would pull the US, I'm quoting him, into the sectarian struggle between Sunni and Shia. Beyond that, he argued that Saudi exported extremism is, quote, no less dangerous to Western interests than Iran's support for radicalism and expansionism. Secretary Blinken argued that an anti-Shia coalition masquerading as a Middle East security alliance will only fuel those sectarian fires and produce more, not less, terrorism. Instead of taking sides in that conflict, Washington should press Riyadh and Tehran to stop feeding it. I could go on and on and on, but it's pretty remarkable and striking that Secretary Blinken, who was such a leading advocate of opposing this kind of a security agreement supported by the United States, is now leading the effort to document it and make it part of US policy. As multiple American administrations have said, the best way to deal with Iran is to develop normal relations with them, end sanctions, and get a nuclear deal. This nuclear deal, Khalil, as you alluded to, this security agreement rather, is a disincentive for all of those things. Why on earth would Iran give up what little leverage it believes it might have vis-a-vis developing nuclear weapons, et cetera, when it's now facing this unified bloc against it? The irony, of course, is that we're offering up a security agreement ostensibly to appease the Sunni Israel bloc in the face of a new nuclear deal, but we're not going to get a nuclear deal because of this agreement for many other reasons. Fourth, Israel. The argument that Biden and some commentators, including Indyk and Cook, have made is that US support for Saudi is necessary to secure Saudi normalization with Israel. Again, another mythology propagated by those who regularly confuse Israeli interests with American ones. First, there's no reason to believe, nor have I ever heard articulated, how such normalization serves American interests or even the interests of peace and security in the region. Indeed, I would venture that unifying the Sunni Israel bloc will only increase their leverage against the United States. And we have yet to see how that is going to fully play out, but we got a small taste of it during this Ukraine war when these bloc collectively refused to support America in the war in Ukraine. There's also zero reason to believe that but for US concessions, there would be no normalization. It's in Saudi interests, it's in Israeli interests to normalize. That's why they're doing it, to support each other's abusive governments as much to squash those they terrorize as to resist any supposed Iranian threat against them. We're being played to pay for it, just as we were played to recognize Golan sovereignty to pay for it, or to sell UAE advanced fighter jets to the UAE to pay for it. These serve Israeli and Gulf interests, not American ones. These normalization agreements only make it easier, of course, for Israel to maintain its apartheid rule by quashing any hope for Arab solidarity to support Palestinian demands for freedom and equality. I think it increases the risks of conflict and violent outbreakings by crushing hope for any kind of diplomatic progress. Biden has told us that peace and security, democracy and freedom are America's national priorities, that these are the priorities we have to champion in order to win really a global contest for ideas against Russia and China. This new security agreement undermines actual peace and security, and supporting these abusive states ensures that they will be able to quash demands for democracy and freedom. It makes no sense to fight for democracy and freedom in Ukraine by supporting tyranny and apartheid in the Middle East. That's what Biden is selling us with this trip, and it's just not credible. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Very, very good comments. And I guess the quotable quote you just gave us is, we are being played. And I think this summarizes this whole visit and the naive way it's been planned and handled thus far. All right, the microphone goes next to Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you, Trita, for joining us. I know you've been very busy on this issue and other issues the past couple of days, and we appreciate your time. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. It's a great, great pleasure being with all of you, with the center. I thought Sarah Leah's presentation was absolutely excellent. She stole a lot of my thunder quotes that I was hoping to use. So I'm going to rearrange my presentation a little bit. I'm going to try to cover 3 points. First of all, I think it's important to recognize, and I think Sarah Leah already hinted at this, I want to go a little bit deeper into it. I think it's really important to recognize that what we're doing with the Abrams Accord in the region is in no way, shape, or form any particularly new or creative idea. This is the continuation of 40 years of organizing the region around the goal of isolating Iran. It has had many iterations, it had had many names, but at the core of it, it has not shifted except under one short 3-year period, and that was when the JCPOA was signed and implemented by the United States. Outside of that, it's been the core of American policy. And we do need to recognize that in order for this to survive, I think Sarah Leah is right that the Saudis and the Israelis have a common interest because of the suppression of their own population to move closer together. I think elevating it to a full normalization, that's where they're seeking to extract concessions from the United States. And the key concessions that they want, of course, is greater American military commitments to these countries. And in the case of the UAE, they leaked information that they and the Saudis have requested more troops on their soil at a time when the American public clearly wants to reduce troop levels, want to bring troops home. But it's important to understand that the Iran component of this is in many ways nevertheless part of the glue. It necessitates not only that there is an enmity right now to kind of compel them to move forward, but it necessitates that that enmity survives, that it endures. If you actually have an improvement of relation, a reduction of tensions between Iran and some of the GCC states, it actually takes away the core foundation for the survival of the Abrams Accord. In fact, take a look at what Jared Kushner himself wrote in his document about the Abrams Accord that was leaked last year by Politico. It clearly states that a reduction of tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia would be a challenge to the durability of the Abrams Accord, because that enmity is needed for this other arrangement to survive. That means that we are going down the path of an agreement, an arrangement, a pact, whatever you want to call it, that actually cements conflict in the region rather than bringing it towards some form of a resolution. There is an interesting historical parallel here as well. About 50 years ago, the tables were turned. The Iranians were the ones who were having a close relationship with Israel behind the scenes because of a sense of shared threat from some key Arab nationalist states and the Soviet Union. But in the early 1970s, the Shah started to dramatically improve relations with Sadat in Egypt. And the fear in Israel at the time, it was actually causing quite a panic, was that if Iran managed to improve relations with Sadat, the foundation for the Iranian-Israeli alliance would start to wither away. I interviewed a senior official under the Shah, retired obviously, about this, and he almost angrily responded to me about any criticism that Iran was improving relations with Sadat, saying that we didn't have Israel as a friend in order to have the Arabs as an enemy. But today, what we're doing with the Abraham Accord is that we have to have Iran as an enemy in order to sustain this rather fake friendship between between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and some of these other states. There's also another historical parallel that gives us a bit of a pause and concern of what this may lead to. In the 1990s, the United States again opted for this approach, but under a different name. Back then, it was dual containment, which was closely tied to the Oslo peace process. Dual containment was a shift from earlier US policies in which was seeking to balance Iran against Iraq. Now the US policy was to balance both Iran and Iraq at the same time. That was closely tied to the Oslo peace process. In fact, Martin Indyk told me, and I quoted him in my book on this issue, saying that the more peace we had between Israel and Palestine, the more Iran would be isolated. The more Iran was isolated, the more there would be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What Indyk and the Clinton administration at the time did not foresee is that that type of approach actually incentivized the Iranians to sabotage the peace process in order to sabotage the broader effort of containing and isolating Iran, however counterintuitive that may sound. But that is exactly the path that Iran went at that time. They had tried to improve relations with the United States in the early 1990s. Instead, the US intensified and doubled down on their isolation, and the Iranian calculation was that the Oslo peace process was the weakest link in this strategy, and as a result, they started heavily supporting Islamic Jihad, Hamas, other groups that were using violence and terrorism against Israel. The difference, of course, and I do have to mention this, the Oslo peace process, one could at least argue, had an ambition of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and moving it towards a two-state solution. The Abraham Accord explicitly does not even have that ambition. It says that it's instead is seeking to move beyond the Palestinian conflict, meaning sweeping it under the rug. But if the Biden trip is successful in the sense that this alliance, this defense pact actually manages to come to fruition, and it's not just empty rhetoric or goals that are spoken about but not really pursued, then the question is, what will the Iranians do? We have no idea whether they have the same capability to be able to do what they did in the 1990s. Their capabilities may be elsewhere. But I would suspect that if it actually starts taking shape and ends up being successful, we will likely see Tehran starting to act similarly to what it did in the 1990s and seeking to undermine stability in other parts of the region in order to make it as costly as possible to try to organize the region against Iran, as costly as possible to seek its complete and prolonged isolation. One last point before I stop. I think it's very important to recognize, I think Sergey was absolutely correct. Oil is not what is driving this. If it is, going back to the JCPOA, it is much easier, faster. An executive order today would actually bring about 80 million barrels of Iranian oil to the market tomorrow, because the Iranians have that much oil on tankers, on the seas, as well as they have pumped up above ground, but they have not been able to sell it because of sanctions. So we could much faster and stronger be able to alleviate high oil prices if this truly was the driving force of this conflict. But what the administration essentially has tried to portray is that this trip is a necessity because the US has no other choices. Geopolitical realities are compelling them to do something that they themselves clearly have some degree of uncomfort doing, as Sarah Leah pointed out when it comes to that op-ed, highly unconvincing, as well as mentioned that the doctors have told Biden that he cannot shake hands and things of that nature. It's important to recognize that this is not correct. There were other options. There were plenty of other things that the Biden administration could have done. Again, when it comes to oil, several options. But there's also one other thing that has now have been happening in the region for the last couple of years, that would have presented a far better approach for the United States. And that is the dialogue and the diplomacy that the Iraqi government has been pushing through the Baghdad dialogue and other venues, in which we have seen a flourishing of regional diplomacy driven mainly by a perception in these countries that the United States is seeking to leave the region militarily. And if it's no longer going to protect them, they are actually better off resolving their own tensions through diplomacy. This is very clearly seen in the conduct of MBS and the Saudis. As long as he thought that he could count on the United States having his back, whatever he did, then he had no interest in diplomacy. Only once he realized that that was not the carte blanche that he thought that it was, did he start seeking to explore diplomacy with the Iranians, the Turks, and others. That process may not succeed, but it has several strengths that the Abrams Accord does not. First of all, the Baghdad dialogue brought in almost everyone in the region, and it was not organized against any single country. It was not seeking to create pacts. It was not seeking to create mini NATOs. It was not seeking to create blocs in the region. It was actually inclusive and seeking to resolve their tensions rather than cementing them through diplomacy. Secondly, it was driven by regional states themselves. It had internal legitimacy. It was not one of these solutions or so-called solutions that were cooked up in Washington and then sought to be imposed on the region from the outside. And thirdly, it did not require prolonged American involvement, and certainly not military involvement. It certainly was helpful in terms of American support for it, could be good as long as the US didn't try to take ownership of it and drive it. But it had the ability to be able to actually free up the United States rather than entrapping it further in the Middle East. That was an option that Biden administration clearly could have chosen. Instead, it has chosen to go back to this path dependency of continuing a policy that has been not only tremendously costly, but tremendously unsuccessful and has directly led the United States into all kinds of failed military operations. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Trita, for your excellent analysis and gave us a lot of food for thought. Hopefully, participants will follow up with you during the Q&A about some of these interesting points that you made. Our third speaker is Cinzia Bianco, Gulf Research Fellow, European Council on Foreign Relations. Cinzia, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to discuss this very important trip. What I want to focus my contribution is on a sort of a wider discourse on American foreign policy in the region, and in particular on consistency. Because what appears, I mean, from a European point of view, what seems very clear is that there is nothing that is clear enough. There's a complete confusion vis-a-vis what the US objectives vis-a-vis the region are, and a very different theories about how the US is wishing to pursue them. Is the US interested in leaving the Middle East and North Africa region? Is it interested in right-sizing, as they say, the presence and redirecting some of that energy to confront greater global challenges, such as those posed by China? Is the US interested in pursuing a nuclear deal with Iran, or isn't it? And you know, how is the US going to pursue that different interests? Will the US sort of change its approach vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, or won't it? I think, you know, it's sometimes might be important for Americans to take a minute and try to sort of put themselves in the shoes of other observers, external observers, and look towards themselves and the kind of messages that that their policies are giving. And I think, you know, the sort of the main message over the past couple of months, for sure, has been one of incredible inconsistency. Even with this trip to Saudi Arabia and the dance that the Biden administration has done on meeting or not meeting, the president meeting or not meeting MBS, is frankly very, very unsettling, because the United States has a certain position in terms of international politics and on the world stage. And that position comes with responsibilities. And let me tell you that as an external observer seen from outside, one of the most important responsibilities is consistency. Choose a path and stick to it. And if the path is wrong and you want to sort of change it, then just say it was wrong and we're going to change it, and explain why are you going to change it, what are you going to do about it, and what your expectations are. Because now we are in a situation where both the United States and Iran, whose government is clearly hijacked by the Revolutionary Guard, have failed to go back to the nuclear deal. And that comes with a number of consequences, of course. And at the same time, we have a US administration and a president that is traveling to Saudi Arabia with the unspoken objective of repairing ties with the most important US partner in the region for decades, but isn't even willing to say so, and isn't even willing to admit that the situation is really critical, that the ties are in a horrible state, and I've followed the Gulf for over 10 years, and I've studied the relationship in its decades-long development. I've never seen US-Saudi relations in such a bad state. And frankly, there are a few voices on both sides, both in Washington and in Riyadh, which are already saying that these are beyond repair, and that are raising a number of reasons why it doesn't make sense for both parties to actively repair their relations and move forward even on key questions such as energy questions or a clear-cut strategic choice to side with the United States and with the West at large, and against China and its subordinates, in which I would put Russia. And that is the reality that we're seeing right now. There is, in that sort of, amid that very confusing reality, it is quite unsettling to having to come to terms with the fact that the US is not providing the kind of leadership that it should provide in any sense and in any way. So I think it's important to take a sort of this, of course, there are a lot of emotions that are running high about this trip, and this has sparked many conversations on US policies in the region. And therefore, this sort of time might be a great time to pause and reflect and sort of take a hard look at what leverages does the United States have with its partners and adversaries, and what positive incentives does the United States have with its partners and its rivals. And this is what international politics is about. It's a mixture of positive and negative incentives, of enticing offers and deploying leverage. But if it's not even clear what these kind of positive incentives might be and what kind of leverage the US has, then it's the equation has as a whole really at the start of it and at the basis of it. And you can see, on Twitter, we are having all sorts of conversations about how this trip may go. And if you sort of look at how different and divergent the opinions are of people from all around the world, and in particular from Saudi Arabia, even on our own Twitter pages and on my own profile, the sort of conversations range from, yes, this might be an opportunity to repair the ties and move over, to actually, no, the Saudis have no incentive to repair ties with the Biden administration because they think that the Democrats will lose the midterm elections and will lose probably the presidential election in 2024. And so there is no sense in sort of compromising. And, you know, I think it's really important that we start from looking at the region and the realities as they are, rather than as we wish them to be. Thanks.
Thank you, Cinzia. Let's now move to Zaha Hasan, who is Fellow Middle East Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she will particularly focus on the role of Palestine and the focus on Palestine in this trip. Go ahead, Zaha.
Thanks, Khalil. Thanks for inviting me, and I really want to say what a great pleasure it is to be with my co-panelists today. As you recalled, Khalil, in your opening remarks, President Biden's op-ed in the Washington Post that was published a few days back, he asserted in that fundamental freedoms and human rights in Israel and the West Bank would be on the trip's agenda. So I think it's fair, after 2 days of him in Israel, to see whether it has in fact been a part of what we know about the engagement between Biden and various Israeli officials. All indications, in fact, are that President Biden is avoiding any discussion of Palestinian rights and Israel's obligations under international law. This trip, as you noted, is really about reaffirming President Biden's personal commitment to Israel, as well as the U.S. longstanding commitment, bipartisan commitment to the special relationship with Israel. And it's also about how the current Democratic administration can deploy that relationship with Israel to in the region to help Democrats stop the bleeding ahead of midterm elections, with inflation at historic levels and oil prices that are too high for political comfort. So Palestinians' peacemaking and the two-state solution is only gratuitously on the Biden Middle East tour agenda, and rights for Palestinians appear nowhere. And this is all too clear after reading the Jerusalem U.S.-Israel Strategic Partnership Joint Declaration, which is a lot of words for a declaration. And it was published today during the second day of Biden's time in Israel. First off, the title of the declaration was a gift to Israel. Naming it the Jerusalem Declaration, which is what it will be called, lends an air of permanence and implies a U.S. continuing commitment to the notion that Jerusalem undividedly is Israeli. Before the presidency of Donald Trump, there may have been some sensitivity around the naming of the declaration this way, but not so. In fact, White House spokesman John Kirby had to do some cleanup after Biden advisor Jake Sullivan referred to East Jerusalem during the flight over to Israel in reference to whether the U.S. would reopen the U.S. consulate that had served Palestinians previously. So you can't even say East Jerusalem anymore in this climate. Second, the declaration promises another 10-year MOU guaranteeing Israel billions more in grants to purchase U.S. weapons, and also any additional funding over that agreed amount in the MOU for missile defense when needed. There's also a promise by the U.S. to never let Iran get nuclear weapons, and it's really not clear exactly what that commitment will entail. But there's that commitment in the declaration. Third, there's this calling out of Palestinian nonviolent resistance to Israeli occupation and apartheid, whether that's at the UN, whether that's at the International Criminal Court, or whether it's by the civil society-led movement to boycott, divest, and impose sanction on Israel until it complies with international law and human rights standards. There's also an affirmation that anti-Semitism may include criticism of Israel that undermines Israel's legitimate place among the community of nations. It's difficult to reconcile what this might mean exactly, since there's also an affirmation of respect for the right to free speech. And what of Palestinians and Israeli-Palestinian peace in the Jerusalem Declaration? Well, the declaration says that the United States and Israel are committed to continuing to discuss the challenges and opportunities in Israeli-Palestinian relations. there is nothing about, Israeli support for a two-state solution. In fact, it's only President Biden says he reaffirms the long-standing and consistent support the U.S. has for a two-state solution. Israel didn't sign on to that affirmation. Both the U.S. and Israel are committed to strengthening the Palestinian economy and improving the quality of life for Palestinians. So essentially, the U.S. has signed on to this idea of shrinking the conflict through economic palliatives. And we knew this before this trip to Israel, but it's been reaffirmed quite vividly in this document. And the stakes, of course, are much higher because in this case, you have a U.S. in a very weak position trying to encourage Israel to use its newfound clout with the Arab Gulf countries towards supporting the U.S. geopolitical agenda. So it has a much more meaning in this document than it had maybe in campaign promises that Biden made in the past. And as for Israel's discriminatory treatment of Palestinians and other Americans seeking entry to the occupied territories and the recently released entry rules that entrench that discrimination, there's no mention of that in the Jerusalem Declaration. Instead, there's an affirmation that Israel and the U.S. are committed to continue their shared and accelerated efforts to enable Israeli passport holders to be included in the U.S. visa waiver program. This is an odd thing to include in this declaration, particularly because in light of the entry restrictions and well-documented discrimination against Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, Muslims, and others, other citizens, when they try to enter Israel, it's very difficult to see how the U.S. could admit Israel into the visa waiver program, which requires that Israeli nationals, the way Israeli nationals get treated when they come to U.S. ports of entry should be extended to Palestinian or to American citizens trying to enter Israeli-controlled ports of entry. And we know that hasn't been the case in the decades of Israel's control over the occupied territories, and that the idea that it's going to change its behavior and become and be admitted into the visa waiver program is hard to believe. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how this plays out. Now, despite the assertions in the declaration, and it's everywhere in the declaration, that these are shared interests, that these are shared values, and that what's contained in the declaration are U.S. national security interests, it's hard to see what the U.S. gets out of all of this. There's a lot of promises made by the U.S. and very little that you see that Israel's giving to the U.S. Even on the issue of Ukraine, where the U.S. had been seeking an Israeli commitment to provide security assistance to Ukraine, there is only a mention of both parties' support for Ukrainian sovereignty and affirmation of the commitment to continued humanitarian assistance. If there's one thing that Biden got from this declaration, it's some recognition that his administration has been engaged in ongoing efforts around the Abraham Accords, and that he is traveling to Saudi Arabia to further Israel's regional integration, which will be developing over time. And I think that phrase was intentional because, like others have said on this panel, there is really little incentive for Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel under our Biden administration. So that may be a little bit of a sort of managing expectations there. So what's missing from the Biden agenda? I'll just go through some things that Palestinians were looking for, particularly Palestinian civil society. There's nothing about accountability for the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen journalist who was shot by Israeli snipers while reporting in Jenin. And this is despite multiple independent investigations that have been conducted that point to Israel as targeting her. No mention of that. There's no mention of the designation of 6 respected Palestinian NGOs as terror organizations. These are human rights organizations that have been engaged in work on the ground to support human rights. And this is despite the fact that various European countries have cleared these organizations and found that there isn't any evidence of terrorism by these organizations. There's no mention of Palestinian American grievances around confiscation of their properties that they own in the occupied territories that have been taken over by Israel for settlements. In fact, the embassy that the Biden administration wants to build in Jerusalem is Palestinian American, part of its Palestinian American private property. So there's no discussion about this issue. And of course, there's no discussion about the over 1,000 Palestinians that are facing eviction in Masafir Yatta in the south of the West Bank, so that Israel can have a firing zone there. And this is despite the fact that Jewish settlers that live in that area aren't being evicted for the firing zone, but the Palestinians are. And there's many other issues that are missing, human rights issues that are fundamental to Palestinian freedom that you don't see on the Biden agenda. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Zaha, very much. I would just like to add with regards to the site of the the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem being built or planned to be built on Palestinian privately owned land from before 1948. At the time, about 10, 12 years ago, we started something called the American Committee on Jerusalem, based on the work and invitation of Dr. Walid Khalidi and some of the data that he collected on this issue. And not only the property is co-owned by several Palestinian families, but actually some of the descendants of those families are American citizens. So that really exposes the administration to all kinds of potential legal issues in the future that they are not planning on probably facing. At any rate, thank you so much to all 4 of you for your great presentations. We do have quite a few questions already from the audience. While I gather these questions, let me ask a general question to all 4 of you. American public opinion. I mean, you know, this country is supposed to be a democracy. Its policy is supposed to be at the behest of the American people, that the American people have some kind of direct and indirect input into the policy. This visit has not been very popular among American people. Public opinion surveys have shown that fewer than 1/4 of Americans approved the trip consistently over the past few months since talk of the trip began. Biden's current low ratings in US polls, clearly the president is suffering from diminishing political currency in a year that's supposed to have midterm elections. And we look at the latest Yahoo News YouGov poll, 18% of Americans say Biden should seek a second term. Among Democrats, only 35% of Democrats believe that he should. Is this low rating and low involvement of public opinion supporting, in general, the president and his policies and his trip, is that going to impact, in your judgment, the trip? Go ahead. It's open to all 4 of you. Trita, I see you're ready.
I'll go after Sarah.
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, I would make 2 observations. One is that this is just a glaring example of how American foreign policy, in particular, versus any other policy of the United States, education policy, environment policy, criminal justice policy, you name it, is the least democratic policy of the US government, where not only does the executive branch feel very little need to show accountability even to the US Congress, much less the American people. And we have had a situation for a very, very long time where executive branches do whatever they want, despite how unpopular it is, like the war in Iraq, because of how little accountability they feel from the American people, and the fact that it very rarely becomes a national election priority, much less a state election priority. This is not what American voters are making their decisions on, and the White House knows that. And that's why they persist in making choices that serve lobbyists as opposed to the American people. With respect to the Biden administration in particular, it's really sad and laughable and pathetic if they think that they are going to win back Saudi and Israeli and defense industry support in upcoming elections for the Democrats to show these lobbying interests that the Democrats can serve them as well as a Trump administration will serve them, because they're never going to believe them, because they know that the people in the Biden administration are doing this because they feel they have no choice as opposed to because they want to. And with the Trump administration and the Republicans, they have no doubts about the alignment of their values and interests. So pathetically, Biden's little groveling strategy is going to fail despite its best groveling efforts.
Mm-hmm. Trita?
Again, I find myself in agreement with Sarah. Let me just add 2 points. First, I think it was quite astonishing in that Washington Post poll that it's not just that it's roughly 25% that support it. It's just that when you ask the question and you say Biden is doing this in order to support Israel or in order to support Saudi Arabia, support for the trip does not go up. It remains around 24, 25%. Opposition to the trip jumps 10 percentage points.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very clear where the public is on these issues. This idea of American leadership in the region, the public increasingly wants the region to show some leadership and responsibility itself, rather than thinking that this is a permanent responsibility of the United States. The other point I would just say, just generally, I think the fact that the administration has chosen this path, despite the fact that when they came in, this table was set for them to be able to continue go in the direction of what Obama had done, at least on the JCPOA, but also on broader issues. In fact, for instance, the groups who had worked to support the Iran deal had also made sure that support for the Iran deal was very strong amongst all Democratic primary presidential candidates, with the exception of Cory Booker. All of them pledged to return to the JCPOA. It was also written into the Democratic Party platform that it's the policy of the Democratic Party to go back into the JCPOA without preconditions. Everything had been set for Biden with minimal political cost to do this. I think part of the reason why they didn't is because this is a profoundly uncreative administration that is operating along the way they think Washington worked 20 years ago. And they think that that political reality, that geopolitical reality, is still what is guiding the world. And it is not. They've been using some nice rhetoric talking about a foreign policy for the middle class. I don't know a single decision in this realm, as well as in some other realms, that you can clearly point to as being beneficial to the very same class that the Democrats know that they are increasingly losing, partly because of some of their foreign policy.
Thank you. Zaha, in an interview yesterday, the President Biden was asked about Democratic Party support or lack thereof for the notion that Israel is apartheid, an apartheid state. And he said, don't worry about this, it's insignificant. Very few, he said, and I'm quoting him, very few people believe in that. Again, going back to public opinion polls, and you know that, I wonder if you could comment on the fact that even within the Jewish community, an organ of the Democratic Party polling the Jewish vote found that 25% among American Jews think Israel is apartheid or practices apartheid. Is the president totally, out of mainstream Democratic Party perspective on this?
Yes. Is the short answer to this. One of the first things that came out of President Biden's mouth when he landed in Israel was to talk about sort of his strong emotional connections to Israel, and describing himself, as he always does in these kinds of situations, as a Zionist himself. And like I said, the purpose of this visit is really to establish himself as, or to reestablish himself as a friend of Israel, and to really show his commitment to Israel. So he is not going to be jumping on the consensus around the fact that Israel is an apartheid regime, even though it's not anything Israel's hiding anymore. And you'll find many Israeli officials talking about it, including the former Attorney General of Israel talking about Israel as an apartheid state. So, once you have various UN bodies, once you've got Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and various other UN mechanisms talking about Israel as an apartheid state, and Israeli officials, Israeli human rights organizations, I think he's purposefully being ignorant to this, because I don't think it's very difficult to come to that conclusion. You don't need a law degree to be able to read the Israeli basic law that says that only Jewish people have a right to self-determination in Israel, and that Jewish settlement is a priority for the rest of biblical Israel. To know what that means, I mean, it's clearly Palestinians, non-Jews living in the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River are lesser and have lesser rights, if any rights at all, if you're living under occupation. And so obviously it doesn't play well for what he's trying to achieve with this trip and with his embrace of regional integration of Israel into the Middle East to be talking about apartheid. And I think it's just as simple as that.
And as an American citizen, it concerns me that, especially when the president keeps referring to shared values, I mean, these abuses and practices that are clearly contradictory to international law and norms, are they part of our shared values? I mean, when he talks, he wants to out-Zionize Netanyahu in terms of his identification. Fine, he's welcome to his opinion, but I don't think he is welcome to creating his own facts. Cinzia, as an outsider from a European perspective, how is that seen? Whether it's benign or purposeful neglect of public opinion, is that noticed in Europe?
Well, there might be a lot of misunderstanding, but in Europe, certainly, when we look at the United States and what moves votes, we certainly don't speak of foreign policy. So there is, in all of my conversation with different European policymakers and sort of commentators, no one has really raised the idea that this trip could hurt Biden in terms of the polls or electoral support. Many have someone hoping, some others less, raised the assumption that if Biden does manage to get what it needs on the energy front, then the trip may help him from an electoral point of view. But that, you know, of course, it remains to be seen, and it is a big, it is a very ambitious objective that the Biden administration isn't even admitting to have in public, and it very much remains to be seen whether that happens or not. You know, from a European point of view, there is a very different outlook towards the entire region that there is in the United States. I think it's important to acknowledge that we share a lot of objectives, and we share, you know, the sort of the more wholesome and the more sort of sophisticated view on human rights, for sure. But also some of the fascinations with some of the countries in the Middle East that there is, I would argue, in the United States, at least at the level of policymakers, is not to be found anywhere in Europe. Some of the assumptions, I mean, of course, we don't have a shared experience in that sense. We never had a hostage crisis with Iran, so where you know, our officials and diplomats were taken hostage. We never had that kind of pact and very solid and very, even sometimes emotional relationship that the US has had with Israel for a long time, based on myths, on shared narratives, and so on. So we come from a different standpoint, and I would argue a much more pragmatic one. There's way less emotions involved in many of the questions that we are discussing today, and there's a more sort of very dry, I would say, attitude towards policies in the Middle East, and very no illusion, no delusion approach to the region.
Thank you. Excellent point. A question came from Martha Gutenberg, and this one is addressed to Sarah earlier. What or who changed Blinken's view in terms of what you referred to him, the 2017 issue? What happened to his rationality that was expressed in that article you referred to? Why the change? Is it the aura of responsibility? You know, I mean, just because he got the position now, or what?
Well, I mean, I write about this in my recent article in American Prospect. I do believe that the Biden administration, to some extent, had both the desire and the opportunity to reduce its entanglements in the Middle East, reduce its absurd, abnormal militarization of the region, support for dictatorship and apartheid in the region. And, you know, they had the wind at their back. This is what the American people wanted. This is what Biden pledged to do. There was a withdrawal from Afghanistan. There was a reduction of troops in Iraq. There was a removal of Patriot missiles. But the overwhelming incentive structure in the government punishes an administration whose actions have the impact of reducing arms sales, i.e., reducing the profits of one of the biggest lobbying industries, who, with very close ties to the Biden administration, with very close ties to our Secretary of Defense, who sits on the board or sat on the board of Raytheon, with very close ties to Secretary Blinken, whose West End Advisory Group and other business ventures was serving the defense industry. They chip away at it, as well as the foreign government lobbyists, Israel in particular, who played a very big role in screaming to the Biden administration about any possible change in policy and strongly lobbying for the US to restore relations with Saudi, to make giant arms sales of advanced weapons fighters, advanced jets to the UAE, and even fought against any cuts in military aid, tiny little cuts in military aid to Egypt. And you know, the way the State Department functions is, you know, that you're punished if you try to disrupt the status quo. You're punished if you try to go against the grain. And these are something that will hinder your career and will most certainly hinder their career prospects. The best way to address this, the best way to have a government actually serves the interests of the American people is to shut down the revolving door that creates incentives for people in government to go and work for lobbyists, including foreign government lobbyists, including the defense industry lobbyists, and shut down the ability of these lobbyists to spend money and influence our government.
Thank you, Sarah. I would like to direct this question from Pedro Frevian to, let's see, to Zaha. Based on personal experience with people from the Middle East in the state of Massachusetts, where I live, how is Israel being a troublemaker in the Middle East from your perspective? I know in your presentation, Zaha, you referred to different things pertaining to Israeli policies and practices, but in trying to help Pedro understand this, in what sense is Israel a troublemaker, particularly maybe in light of the visit?
Well, I think to start, we could talk about the export of certain technologies that are now being used by various Arab governments to undermine their rights and to undermine their ability to express their opinion about their governments and the regimes that they live in. Obviously, Israel is a bad actor when it comes to how it engages with international bodies, multilateral bodies, the kinds of influence it deploys through the US to weaken those institutions impacts everybody, not just Palestinians, because once those institutions lose credibility as neutral arbiters of international law, and once they stop pursuing accountability for human rights abuses and no longer engage in the peace and security job that they were empowered with, then all of us suffer around the world, because there's no longer any respect for these kinds of ideas and these kinds of values that really are, what distinguish the international system. It's what holds us together. It's what prevents us from being reduced to might is right and chaos, really. And so that's I think how Israel is impacting all of us beyond Palestinians living under occupation or as second-class, third-class citizens inside of Israel, but more, as I said, in the region, in the Middle East itself. It's the way in which it's using its technologies as a way to leverage various relationships in the Middle East towards normalizing Israel's apartheid regime.
And it's interesting, since technology played such an important role in this visit and in the agreements emerging from this visit, it doesn't seem to me that an administration that's so focused on human rights and basic rights and freedoms is so negligent, doesn't even think twice about this contradiction in terms of its values on the one hand.
In fact, it's being rewarded in this, there's this high level dialogue now around technology that the US and Israel are going to begin. And it's really unclear at this point what that's going to mean. What kind of cooperation are we talking about? So you're right. Instead of sort of demanding some kind of accountability for the use and misuse of these technologies, we see sort of a bonding of US-Israeli relations around technology.
Yeah, another interesting component to that, it relates to what Sarah Leah mentioned earlier. I mean, the deal that was just signed the past 48 hours between Israel and Bahrain to sell drones, offensive drones, if you will, and their related technology, radars, and what have you, to Bahrain. At a time, this is a client that has been dependent on US, and with the influence of, I wonder how the US arms industry is going to react to something funded, technology funded by the United States in Israel, and being now sold in competition with their own interest as companies, arms sales in the region, allowing Israel to sell that. And of course, that requires permits from the United States, from the Pentagon and the State Department before Israel could do that. So the US is funding programs that are ending up competing with the industry that is so influential. It would be interesting with the increasing role of weapons and arms sales as a result of this visit, how the industry is going to react. Trita, with regards to Iran, why is this Iran policy? Why is this is Ziad Boubaker would like to know, why is the US and the EU are so concerned and somewhat obsessed with Iran's enrichment level and uranium program, and not concerned at all about Israel with its massive arsenal of nuclear weapons?
It is a very good question. Let me start off by saying, though, I don't see efforts to prevent proliferation in and of itself being problematic. I think the Iranians have cheated on the NPT in the past. There has been dishonesty from them in many regards. So to see that issue requiring addressing, and I think the JCPOA was a very good way of addressing, I think is fully legitimate. One can definitely ask the question, why so much focus on Iran, almost none on Israel, given the fact that he has nuclear weapons, almost none on South Korea when they were enriching up to 90% in other countries. So there's clearly a bit more of a focus there. I think the fundamental answer is that Iran, since the revolution, has pursued an anti-US hegemony policy and has sought to reduce American influence and hegemony in the region at a time when both the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, on the contrary, are very eager for a continued strong American military presence in the region. They want to benefit from the balance of power that the American hegemony has provided them in the Middle East, a balance that at least the Saudis and the Emiratis could not be able to create on their own, but that they can benefit from because of the very, very heavy finger that the American military might put on the scale in the region. So as a result, the United States has been turning a blind eye to a lot of things that, for instance, the Saudis have been doing. Right now, the Emiratis are occupying and annexing Yemeni islands, which we apparently have no problem with, at the same time that the US is taking a very strong position against any attempt by the Russians to annex Ukrainian territory, which I think is correct. That annexation is illegal and in violation of international law, but so is the Emirati one. The difference being they're all in support of strong American hegemony in the region. Iran is not. So there's going to take a significant shift in order to be able to overcome some of this. And that shift is essentially for the United States to rethink whether hegemony actually is serving its own interest. I think there is a reason why the Obama administration had an easier way going in the direction that it did. It did not value hegemony in the Middle East. It was seeking to reduce it dramatically, and it was not just talking about it, it was actually trying to do something about it, and it wanted to shift towards Asia as a result of this. As long as that is the case, you're going to see one of the underlying sources of tension between the United States and Iran reduce. As long as the United States is seeking to retain that posture in the Middle East, we're going to see an intensification of that tension between the US and Iran, while continuing to turn a blind eye when the Saudis, Emiratis, and others pursue policies that are equally destabilizing as many of the policies that Iran has pursued.
There's another question for you, Trita, with regards to the Saudi-Iranian dialogue that you referred to earlier, Baghdad and what have you. Why doesn't Iran call Israel's bluff and bury the hatchet with Saudi Arabia and the UAE at this time? What's preventing that?
Well, the question kind of assumes that this is just something that Iran could do on its own. The Iranians did try to pursue diplomacy with the Saudis from the very first day that Rouhani became president in 2013. In his opening speech, he declared Iran's intent to resolve tensions with what he called our brothers in Saudi Arabia. There was no interest on the Saudi side as long as they saw that the US and Iran were pursuing diplomacy, and the Saudis feared that the United States was seeking to replace Saudi Arabia as a partner in the region and instead pivot to Persia, so to say. We only saw an interest from the Saudi side for that dialogue once it became clear to them that the US was not going to go to war with Iran on Saudi Arabia's behalf. This is after the Iranians attacked the Saudi oil fields. And once they realized that if there actually is a war in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE are going to be on the forefront and they're going to suffer tremendously from it. Only then did we see an interest. The question now is, from the Saudi side, is the pursuit of diplomacy that has now gone on for a couple of rounds, has made some progress, not significant. Is it a hedging strategy in which they're trying to hedge and wait to see whether there's going to be a JCPOA or whether there's going to be a US confrontation? Or is it genuinely driven because the Saudis have come to the strategic conclusion that they need to have a reduction of tensions with Iran? On the Iranian side, I do think that they have come to that strategic conclusion. This has also been very much part of what the Raisi government believes is their shift away from the Rouhani government's policy. They accuse the Rouhani government's policy of neglecting regional diplomacy because they put all of their eggs in the JCPOA basket. They said that the Iranian foreign ministry was no longer going to be the ministry of the JCPOA, and they were going to really do an outreach to some of the Arab states. I do believe the Iranians have made that strategic decision. Have the Iranians been flexible enough? Have they been pursuing diplomacy in an effective way? I don't know about that, but I do think that the problem lies in both capitals, and neither one of them can single-handedly resolve the problem.
Question from my colleague at Arab Center, Gregory F. Tendelian. If Netanyahu becomes prime minister again in a few months, will this change Biden's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue? In other words, will he become a bit more critical of Israeli policies? Let's give Sarah and Zaha a chance to respond to Gregory. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you take the massive love and affection that Biden just showed Netanyahu on this recent visit, taking off breaking his doctor's orders to shake only Bibi's hands, despite the fact that Bibi is facing corruption trial at the same time, and reassuring him literally that he loves him. I think we can expect to see nothing more critical from the Biden administration with respect to Israel. I think particularly on Israel, more on Israel than certainly Saudi Arabia or the UAE, the Biden administration feels it has to keep pro-Israel voters close to its side and would not do anything because they are still operating in a 20-year-old mentality.
Cinzia, sometimes these gestures, trips, what have you, tend to motivate some policy decisions. Do you expect Europeans to react to this visit, whether it succeeds or fails, in terms of a corrective measures, considering the discrepancy between EU positions and American positions vis-a-vis the region?
I expect the Europeans to just continue pursuing what they have been. Trita was referring to the Baghdad conference that was co-organized by France. The European Union has just put out a joint communication on strategic partnership with the Gulf that envisions a special representative on Gulf security, whose mandate is being negotiated as we speak, but most probably will be working specifically and focusing specifically on keeping communication open between the regional players and beyond, and sort of trying to preserve some lines of communications amid what is clearly a step towards escalation in the region. France has also been working with the Iraqi prime minister, but of course, the fact that Iraq does not have a government is making it very difficult. So they are also sort of flanking that with another government from the region to do a second round of the Baghdad conference. And that is what Europeans have arguably sort of long been busy doing, and they will continue doing that. They were, of course, the ones at various times, they were the only ones trying to keep the JCPOA alive. The Chinese have shown a lot of disinterest. The Russians have been trying to actively torpedo the deal to make more money with selling their own oil. The Iranians have come back and forth with new demands, old demands, and basically very, very inconsistent. The Americans, the Biden administration could have gone back with a simple executive order and instead went into this chicken dance that has led us to basically the collapse of the negotiations. So I think, there will be a lot of consistency and continue to working for diplomacy and mediation and de-escalation, which is what which has always been a European objective and continues to be a European objective.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. Let me conclude with a short announcement. Just as you were speaking a minute ago, I guess as a joint statement was just issued by the US, Israel, and the UAE and India, for God's sake, with regards to the informal talks that they just had this morning in the context of the visit to Israel today. And I haven't, of course, it just came out. I haven't read the statement, but to me, it's ironic that President Biden lands at Ben Gurion's airport and talks about peace and stability in the region and so on. And if he were to simply just take his sunglasses off and look to his left, he would have seen the hills of the West Bank, where this peace and stability that he keeps talking about is more needed than India, I would say. He doesn't have to go as far as India to search for regional peace and stability. At any rate, thank you to all four of you for your great presentations. Thank you to our audience, 100+ people who have participated and stayed with us. I apologize to those. There are quite a few questions left that we didn't get a chance to deal with typically because of time. And we invite our audience to join us again in a future event at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Peace to all of you. Thank you for your participation. Bye-bye.